So there is no relationship between our incarceration rates and crime rates, which is kind of one of the more interesting things in the data.
Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Personal Responsibility Lawyer Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Lovins from the law firm Lovins Trosclair, where we are personal injury lawyers dealing in catastrophic injuries, deaths, and other terrible things that happen. For goodness sake, I hope you don't ever need me. But if you do, please do get in touch with us, and you can find out more about us at www.ltlegalteam.com. I have a very exciting guest today, a professor from the New York University School of Law, Rachel Barkow. Rachel is a professor of criminal law and also administrative law at New York University Law School. She went to Harvard Law School and clerked for a couple of judges, most notably Justice Antonin Scalia of the U.S. Supreme Court. Professor Barkow has a book out called Prisoners of Politics, Breaking the Cycle of Mass Incarceration. I had to look at the subtitle there to make sure I got it right. So Prisoners of Politics, Breaking the Cycle of Mass Incarceration. It is about criminal justice reform, and it is an excellent and very full of information book, and I highly recommend it, and I am excited to talk about it today. Professor, welcome to the Personal Responsibility Lawyer.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So my first question is, how did you become interested in criminal justice reform?
Generally, I'm interested in governmental power, and in particular, making sure that it doesn't infringe on the rights of individuals. So I teach administrative law and criminal law both because I'm very interested in the ways in which government intersects with our lives. But I've gravitated more and more over the years to the criminal side of things because the overreach is just so extreme in the criminal law context that, it's just seeing how counterproductive our governmental policies are, how much human misery they leave in their wake and are not making us any safer. So, just seeing something that's as poorly designed and implemented as the way we do criminal justice in America, I kind of drawn to it to call attention to it in the hopes that we can make it better.
So one of the things that you mentioned early on in Prisoners of Politics, or Prisoner, I have said prisoners, I think, multiple times, but it's prisoner singular. And first of all,
oh, no, you have it right with plural. You're
okay.
Right. It is plural.
I'm looking at something else that they got it wrong, and I was incorrectly looking at that. So I apologize for that. Why did you choose that title?
Well, so it's got two meanings. On the one hand, it obviously refers to the people who are imprisoned in the United States, the 2.2 million people who find themselves behind bars. But it also refers to the rest of us, kind of every person in the United States who are prisoners of a really failed political system in the sense that we can't seem to get better outcomes because this political process is so dysfunctional.
You just referenced that a lot of these policies that infringe upon people's liberty, they don't make us safer. And one of the first quotes that just really jumped out at me from the book, it's on page 18. It just says, "It is a sad irony that a political process that obsessively uses the rhetoric of public safety ends up producing so many policies that in fact undermine it." I think that's a very surprising thing for most people. It honestly, it was for me. I'm fairly new to the criminal justice reform conversation, for lack of a better word. And the first thing that kind of caught my attention about it is there's a lot of this that's just not fair, and people are being punished in ways that are just not fair. And if government's going to infringe on our liberty, it ought to do so in a way that is fair and reasonable and whatever other adjectives you want to use. But one of the big points of your book is that it's not just unfair, it's actually bad for those of us who are not in the criminal justice system. Tell us a little bit, and I'm asking you to, take a large portion of your book and distill it to a 90-second soundbite, and that's not fair, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. I think that's one of the things that I most wanted to get across in the book is that it's not like we're experiencing a trade-off in these policies where we're creating all this misery for people, but in exchange, we're making ourselves safer. Instead, it really is this lose-lose environment. And that's the ultimate tragedy of it all. So we do things like make it almost impossible for people when they come out of prison to stay on a law-abiding path because we impose so many collateral consequences on their conviction. We deny them access to housing, to occupational licenses, to get public assistance as they transition. That you're setting people up to fail. We take away their driver's license, and they live in places where you have to have a car to drive to jobs. So we do things like that. We have excessive amounts of pretrial detention in America, even though when you detain somebody pre-trial, when they get out, you've made it that much harder for them, again, to stay on this law-abiding path because while they were detained, they most likely lost their job. They often lose custody of their children. They get evicted from their houses. So we do all these things that end up being so extraordinarily disruptive in people's lives that they're the exact things that trigger criminal behaviors because we put people in situations where they really have no choice. And, if we were to kind of pursue these policies in a more rational way, we'd recognize, these are not great ideas for public safety. And we would get better outcomes, for all of us, including the people accused of crimes, if we just had a different approach to how we dealt with it. But, it's very hard to have rational conversations in the political environment in which we live because anytime you want to say anything that looks like it's a softening of how we're treating people, that kind of, you're coddling criminals kind of attack comes up when in fact, it would actually be policies that would make us all safer.
Which the whole political conversation, one of the things you mentioned fairly early in the book is there's basically two different reasons to punish or incarcerate. One is retributive justice, getting the just desserts. They did something bad. There needs to be some sort of punishment as a matter of justice. And then the other is rehabilitation. And we want to take people who have done bad things, somehow rehabilitate them and so that they will be less dangerous, more productive members of the community. How do those two, are those in conflict, both in practice and in the political conversation, or are they actually complementary? They're very different. Can the law accommodate both? Can it really do either? That's a pretty broad question, but the concept of these two different things, they're such different purposes of criminal punishment. And I'm trying to sort through in my own head what the interplay between the two is, both practically and politically.
Yeah, so they could be in harmony with each other, but sometimes they may come into conflict. So, so I'll give a couple examples to kind of flesh that out. So we do some things in our current approach to criminal punishment that I think don't make sense under any theory of punishment. So I think if you were to ask somebody, should somebody get a longer sentence for looking at pictures of child pornography than actually abusing a child, I don't think anyone in America would say that. I think the actual abuse of a child should be punished more harshly. But that's not how our system is currently operating. You get much longer sentences for the child pornography. So that as a matter of retributive justice makes no sense because it's not proportional to how society views the severity of the crime. And there's lots of examples like that. The sentences we give for people who traffic in drugs are orders of magnitude longer than for people who commit rapes and homicides. So if you get a federal drug sentence, you're looking at a really long sentence compared to someone who commits one of those other crimes. So I do think as a matter of even retributive justice, making sure someone gets their just desserts, we have punishments in America that are really out of whack based on kind of any ranking order of those kinds of crimes. And fixing that and making them more in line with what the public views as more serious, I think that would be both good for retributive justice and it would be good for public safety because we are incarcerating some people for far longer than they need to be in order to get public safety benefits. And there comes a point when you incarcerate somebody after a certain period of time, keeping them in there actually is a public safety negative. So there was a study out of Texas, for your listeners, where they looked at people in Texas prisons, and after they'd served a couple years, for each additional year that the person served, they had an increased risk of recidivism. And holding constant the crime they committed in their record. But the idea is, the longer you're in prison, the further away you are from the people who care about you and your social network. You're far away from learning about new technological advancements and all the ways that society progresses. And, you're in an environment where there's probably very little programming, and you need to be aggressive to not be attacked by your fellow prisoners. And so, it creates a really bad place for someone to spend a really long time in and then come out and integrate successfully. So keeping people in there longer than necessary is actually bad for public safety. So there's a way in which, if we reduced some of those disproportionate sentences, we could align our retributive justice values and these, utilitarian values of public safety. Having said that, I think it's important to acknowledge, though, that there could be a conflict. So, for example, I said earlier that we have all these collateral consequences that people get when they're convicted of felonies. So they lose access to various public benefits. They can't get a driver's license. Their driver's license is taken away. And those things are all terrible as a utilitarian matter of public safety. Like, we wouldn't want to do any of those if our goal was public safety, because giving people those kinds of benefits and transitional help helps get them on a path for law-abiding behavior that they'll stick with. But, setting up hurdles makes it harder. But there are people who believe they just should not have those things as a matter of punishment. And, that's where retributive justice goals and these more utilitarian goals could come into conflict. Because you could have someone saying, I just don't want them to have a driver's license because I don't believe someone who commits a felony should get that privilege of driving anymore. And if someone has that view where they just want to take it away from somebody because they don't believe they deserve it anymore once they've committed a crime, they may be pursuing that as a matter of retributive justice, but they should know when they're doing it that, it's a little bit of cutting off your nose to spite your face, because you're setting this person up now then to make it, what are they supposed to do? They have to choose between driving on a suspended license, to try to get to a place of employment, or, no job at all. And then they're going to have to turn to unlawful means to earn money. And so I think that's where they may come into conflict. And then we as a society just need to choose which value matters more to us.
So I don't really remember the 1993 crime bill. It's been something of a topic of discussion in the Democratic presidential primary, because then Senator Biden he at least voted for it. I don't remember if he was a leading figure in advancing it. But if I remember right, the 1993 crime bill made a lot of things, a lot of penalties much more harsh than they were before. And it was largely in response to a significant rise in crime over the years preceding that. And then at some point, not too long after that, there was a decline in crime. The advocates of the 93 crime bill say that in that case, the correlation is a causation. Is my understanding of what happened in terms of the rise in crime, then the passage of the 93 bill, and then the fall in crime, is it factually accurate? And if it is, why do we not look at that as, why isn't it a causative relationship as opposed to just correlation?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. So there is no relationship between our incarceration rates and crime rates, which is kind of one of the more interesting things in the data. We do see in the 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s, when crime is up in America, based on the measures of violent crime, homicides, robberies, crime is up, and there is a public demand for a different approach to how to fight it, how to deal with it, which leads to a lot of legislative reforms. And those reforms in turn lead to higher incarceration rates. So at the kind of beginning of the rise of incarceration in America, there is this link to crime rates. What's interesting, though, is, we kind of keep incarcerating, and then, through the 1980s, and what I would say there's a host of federal laws that are being passed in this period. There's legislation in 1986, that makes big changes in federal law. There's the 94 crime bill that makes additional big changes. So, we're seeing a lot of things happening in 1984, there's legislation, and those things are increasing incarceration rates at the federal level. But remember, the federal government is really responsible for a very small portion of crime fighting in America. So that legislation is just dealing with drug crime, maybe some firearms offenses, but the bulk of our crime fighting in America takes place at the local level, at the state level. So, anything the feds do, there's just no evidence that there's a link between that and crime rates. So, what's interesting is when you go start state by state and you start to explore the relationship between state incarceration rates and crime rates, what you find is, there really just isn't one. And, the best data that's out there trying to figure out, if we kind of took collectively what's the relationship between incarceration and crime rates, and in particular, when we've started to experience that great crime decline that you mentioned that starts in the 1990s and thankfully has really continued till today, the highest estimates for the effect of incarceration on that, the highest estimates are that it accounts for about 25% of that decline. Whereas other studies find it's 5% or it's not a relationship at all. So, it's a little hard to know which of those to credit and which not. But given the fact that the most generous studies of all say that incarceration accounts for maybe 25% of that decline, that means that 75% of the crime decline is from other things that have nothing to do with incarceration. And those could be anything from more police presence to taking lead out of the water, to more economic opportunities for people, more stable housing opportunities. There's a range of possible things it could be. But the other thing I would just point out is that, so it's not that incarceration bears no relationship to having an effect on crime. It's just that it's a much smaller player than these other things. In particular, even when you're just thinking about criminal justice policies, there's just reams and reams of data on this, that when someone is thinking about whether or not to commit a crime, the thing they care most about is whether or not they're going to get caught. So, if you had to invest your limited criminal justice dollars on something, it would be much better to invest it in detection mechanisms, whether it's policing or cameras or something else, than it would be in having longer sentences, because that just doesn't affect people in terms of their whether they're deterred from committing crime. So there's a relationship there. It's something to consider, but when you really look at all the evidence, what you find is, the relationship between incarceration and crime is really tenuous. Two, the federal government's role in all this is there's really no evidence of that. That is such a small part. It's about 5% of the total criminal justice prosecutions in America are federal ones. And, they're not the kinds of crimes I think the public is most concerned with. It's not homicides and rapes and robberies. It's immigration offenses, drug trafficking, some firearms, and some fraud. So it's really not dealing with the kind of street crime that most people are thinking of. And there's no evidence that federal changes have made a difference on that. And then just the last thing I'll add is that, we have in recent years seen both the federal government and many states lower their incarceration rates quite significantly. So, at the federal level, it was a drop in population of about 30,000 people from the federal system with no increase in crime. And again, I think you won't find an increase or decrease based on federal actions. But at the state level, we've seen state after state around the country really change their laws and reduce their prison populations, including Texas. And again, no increase in crime rates. In fact, some have seen the same march towards lower crime rates.
My understanding is that the U.S. Incarceration rate is way higher than most other countries, and we'll just take Europe for now, Western European countries that culturally are more similar to the United States than a lot of other countries. Was there a time when the U.S. incarceration rate was more in line with other countries?
Yes, for all of our history up until the 1970s. So we looked like the rest of the world until the 1970s, and our own rates were very stable internally. So, their criminologists wrote books about it of kind of, what accounts for stability, why we're so stable. They all had to revise once the 1980s start. But for most of our country's history, we looked like every other place in the world, and there was nothing outlier about our practices. That all shifts in the 1980s. So now we incarcerate more people than any other country in the world, and by orders of magnitude higher. And even our states that have lower incarceration rates would still be outliers compared to Europe, so even a state like Massachusetts would incarcerate far more people than any average European country.
Did we see in the U.S., a spike in crime that preceded that they didn't see in Europe or other countries? Or was it we just took a different response to things that happened? Why did we diverge, I guess, is what my question really is.
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons. So as I said, there is this kind of uptick in crime at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s that does lead to changes in U.S. practices. And that uptick, it's a combination of both an increase in crime and also kind of a general sense of disorder, because at that point you also have a lot of protests, a lot of urban riots. So there's just a kind of a sense of disorder that leads American voters to want a change in policy. So, so that's kind of one thing that's different. The second thing that's different is we do have more violent crime in America than in those other places. In particular, we have far more gun violence in America than in any of those European countries. And so, that's a difference. And, a third difference would be our population is not as homogenous as it is in those European countries. And so, you have tied up with any criminal justice practice and policy in America, it's inextricably linked with notions of race and biases that voters may have in terms of their association of crime and race. And all those things together, create an environment, I think, in America that leads toward a public that really leans towards more severe responses, again, partly in response to actual increases in violence, but also partially in response to kind of a sense of fear that the populace may feel based on just how things are covered by the media and whatnot in America. And then the last thing that I think is really different from other places is we elect our prosecutors and our sheriffs and our judges. So the people responsible for criminal justice policy in America are directly elected by the people. And that's not true in any European country. Those posts are held by a kind of professional core of bureaucrats who are trained to make policies on the basis of evidence and good information. Whereas here, they're running campaigns and then they're running campaign ads. So that means that you're going to get people in those offices who, if there is a public fear of crime or, any kind of racial overtones to campaign ads, you'll see it in these elections for sheriff and prosecutor and for judicial spots. And that does affect our policies. And particularly as you enter the 1970s, 1980s, it's not just that there's, an increase in crime, but the TV is now we have television. And so you're getting people seeing, ads on the news. They're seeing news reports. They're seeing campaign ads that are running on TV. And I think all that together creates an environment that just makes it more likely that you get voters supporting these very punitive policies.
One of the things you point out in the book is the amazing number of local news segments or the 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock news or whatever, the percentage that lead with some sort of a crime as the top story. It was, I don't really watch a lot of TV news of any sort, so I didn't know what to expect, but I was stunned. I don't have it in front of me, but the percentage of days where the local news lead with some kind of crime as the top story is staggering. Is that simply a phenomenon of kind of if it bleeds, it leads sort of phenomenon in popular culture, or is there something else that's going on there where there's a lever we can push to take sensationalized things not out of the news, but so that they're in a less prominent place and they don't have that disparate impact on policy that they currently have?
Yeah, I'm not sure how we go about solving it, but it's definitely true that it's almost a third of all of those newscasts are leading with stories like that. And it's true whether crime is up or down. So again, it helps to account for that poor relationship between incarceration and crime rates, because the public doesn't really have a good appreciation of whether crime is going up or down. If your newscast is always leading with a crime story, you don't really have a sense of what the overall data looks like. You just know, wow, I'm just constantly seeing these stories.
Yeah.
So, and that's true of newspaper coverage as well. The same is true if you could study New York Times coverage of criminal justice issues, and it stays constant throughout the 1990s and the 2000s and up till today, same proportion, even though crime rates have fallen dramatically. So they're stories of interest to the public. People are fascinated by crime stories, and they're fascinated by the non-fictional coverage and fictional accounts, right? Those are stories that people gravitate towards. So that's why it's harder to know how you can counter it. I mean, I do think the media could do a better job covering the stories of the people who are affected by criminal justice in terms of being charged with crimes, serving sentences, because we're at a point now in America. The other statistic that I think usually shocks people is 1 in 3 adults in America has a criminal record now, which is a staggering number. I mean, 1 out of every 3 adults has some kind of criminal justice involvement. So we're talking about an enormous proportion of our population directly affected by criminal justice. 1 out of every 2 people has a family member, a close family member, who's been incarcerated. So we have people now in America directly affected by the other side of this. And, certainly the media could do more to highlight some of those stories. People serving excessive sentences for things. People getting caught up in pretrial detention when they haven't been convicted of any crime at all, just because they can't afford to pay their bail. I think there's a way in which we could have other stories as part of the mix. But more importantly, I think we really need to be setting our criminal justice policies not based on kind of general voter attitudes about things, but instead, having the voters say what they'd like to achieve with criminal justice, let's say public safety, but then put people in place who could actually look at data and evidence as opposed to kind of going off these one-off stories that they may see on the news.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of laws that have specific names attached to them, the Amber Alerts, and I think there's one that's Megan's Law, and there's a pretty long list of them, both at the federal and various state levels, that are understandable in a lot of ways, responses to horrific things that have happened, but they get a reaction. And another thing that you referenced that's kind of in the same vein is the Willie Horton ad from back in the, I guess it was 88 campaign. And then Mike Huckabee, when he was governor of Arkansas, there's a couple of clemency or early release things that did lead to some horrific crimes being committed. But in the wake of the publicity over those horrific crimes, the larger data set is lost. In the fact that, 99% of those who were given early release didn't go on to commit. And I'm using, I think 99% actually for the Massachusetts. I think that's actually the number that's in the book. But this is kind of getting out of the criminal law aspect and more into the public relations part of it. But any thoughts on how to combat the sensational story with the data?
It's really hard if you're trying to do it in the public sphere, and I think we intuitively kind of know about this if you think of other decisions you make, you could have the record of airline safety and know that overall, it's tremendously, tremendously safe to travel by air. But, if there is a crash someplace and it's covered on the news, people are antsy about flying. Or, vaccines are safe and effective and important. But, if someone knows of one story that they heard about, you get a whole movement of people who are nervous about it. So I think the way to address that kind of issue is that we put in place institutions and structures that help us to get better outcomes. And I think I just personally don't think that media battle can really ever be won, because people just naturally emotionally gravitate towards those stories. And then they have salience in their mind, even if they don't want them to. There's just the cognitive biases that we all have on these kinds of things. You can kind of tell your rational self one thing, but those stories stick in your mind. And so I think the way to approach that is the way we approach it in almost every other regulatory sphere, which is, so we have an agency that deals with air safety, and they figure out, exactly what needs to be done for travel safety, recognizing that unfortunately, rarely, every now and again, we're going to have accidents, but the benefits far, far outweigh those accidents. Similarly with vaccines, that far and away the benefits make sense. And as you said, if you took, for example, that furlough program that was at issue in Massachusetts that Willie Horton was on furlough, his was the failed case. But 99.9% of the other cases had the people returning to the prisons with no problems at all. And so when you're setting a criminal justice policy, we really should be setting it for the 99.9%, not on this notion of the, 0.001, because when we do that, what we ignore is there's real cost to that. It not only the cost to obviously the human lives of the people who don't get the benefit of those programs, but as I said at the outset, it's actually a public safety cost for all of us. So, once we start getting rid of parole and programming for people and anything that looks like you're reducing someone's sentence or you're giving them a break or a program of any kind, all that is those programs, those things, many of them are really good for public safety, and they're good investments, and they save us money and they make us safer. So they're really good fiscal policies. So the question is just how can you put in place a structure that allows you to get those policies without them being torpedoed by the one bad outcome that might get news attention, but is actually not representative of how a program overall is working. And as I said, in these other places and spheres, we've figured out how to do that, because it's really important when you're setting policy, to set it based on the vast majority of cases as opposed to the outliers. But when it comes to criminal justice, it's just this very weird space where it's basically policy set by people's gut instincts. And unfortunately, those gut instincts are often wrong.
I want to go back to the correlation or lack of correlation between incarceration and crime rates. And as much as 25%, but that's a very optimistic estimate of how much incarceration affects crime rates. And you mentioned there are a lot of other things that could impact it, ranging from economic opportunities to lead in the water, all of which they make some sense to me. Do we have any sort of consensus on what the other things are and which levers are more effective? And by levers, I just mean creating more economic opportunity or, cleaning up hazardous substances in the environment or drinking water or whatever. How much do we really know about what other factors actually help reduce crime?
I wish we knew more. I'll start with that by saying, we don't have perfect information on it. I mean, we do know things we could do that are better and cost effective and reduce crime. So, I kind of start with those things. So, for example, home visits to new parents where they learn how to interact with their children, actually bears enormously positive consequences later. Giving new parents of newborns really helpful information right at the outset in terms of caring for their children. Similarly, pre-K, early childhood education, those things are correlated with reductions in crime later. It's tough though, because you're asking the public to make an investment in something that's not going to bear fruit for, 18 years. Yeah. And, we don't tend to be a society that's really great. If you look at our debt, we're not really great at looking forward on things, right? It's a kind of here and now. And certainly our elected officials, they want to get reelected now. And if they're proposing something that's not going to have a benefit for 18 years, it's tough to run on that. So we don't have a really great environment for doing those kinds of things, but we know that those things work. And the other thing we know is we know the things that we're doing that make things worse. So, another big part of what we could be doing is just let's stop doing the things that make things worse for people. And, my book is a long list of those that things we do in criminal justice that, not only don't make things better, but affirmatively make things worse and cost us money. So these are things that, really any sensible government should just stop. Like, we should just stop taking away people's driver's licenses, unless they are a threat to safety on the roadways, and otherwise that should not be how we use our punishment scheme is, we're mad at them because they sold drugs. But if they've never actually driven while under the influence of a substance, then they should get to keep their license so that they can go out and get a job, so that they don't sell drugs again. There's a whole bunch of things like that we do that, we have evidence doesn't make any sense. Or, we could, instead of incarcerating as many people as we do, lots of evidence that it would be much better to invest in diversion programs for people. So if they have an underlying drug problem or they have an underlying mental health issue, get them treatment for that, deal with that underlying problem, and then, kind of get them out of the government, so then they're not kind of going through a revolving door, kind of in and out of our jails constantly, which is what we see. We see people cycle in and out of prisons and jails repeatedly because they have an underlying issue that's never dealt with. It's just kind of kicking the can down the road where they're incarcerated, then they're let out, but they still have the problem. So they reoffend, they come back in. There's those kinds of things that we can be doing that are, really sound investments. We save money when we do it. We create better public safety outcomes. And, we respect the person involved by helping them get on their feet. So there's those kind of easy policy calls. But, admittedly, we don't know as much as we need to or should about what causes crime. A lot of people had expected with the economic downturn, we were going to see a spike in crime because of the relationship between economics and crime, and we didn't. So there are some aspects of, while there is a relationship between neighborhoods, the schooling, and economic opportunities, that big kind of nationwide economic decline didn't result in an increase in crime. So, we don't know as much as we should or that I wish we did, but we know enough to do better is, I guess, the way I would put it.
On the issue of, this is both kind of on the retributive aspect of punishment and also the rehabilitative. But I think one of the things that plays into that is what we lawyers call mens rea, but what normal people would call the state of mind of the person who commits the offense. And you talk at some length about how our criminal law in the last few decades has removed a lot of the state of mind aspects of an offender's of how a sentence is decided and of the crimes that they're actually charged with. And some of those things were, I thought, just shocking, the way that we punish for essentially accidental crimes. Can you discuss that a little bit? Because I don't think most people are aware of those. Most people that would listen to this, who are not probably the people who have any significant chance of being caught up in anything other than perhaps white-collar crime. Because I just don't think, I may be totally wrong about this, but I don't think that most of the people who are likely to be caught up in the criminal justice system through violence or even drug things typically listen to podcasts about legal stuff. Could be wrong. I haven't done market research, but that's my thought.
Yeah. So, it's a really interesting point, kind of where we go wrong in terms of how we write our criminal laws in the first place. And, I would say the biggest flaw is how we set our criminal laws because we have in mind the worst kind of offender in a category. So, for example, and I'll get to mens rea in a second as well, but kind of just thinking about the general problem more broadly, there's a way in which let's say politicians are thinking about a particularly horrible instance of sexual abuse. So maybe it's a sex offense against a child, and they pass a law to address it, and they talk generally about how they want to deal with sex offenders, and who they have in mind is that kind of crime and criminal behavior, someone who commits an offense against a child. But if you look to the way that jurisdictions actually define who is a sex offender around the country, it includes people who their crime was soliciting a prostitute, or it includes two teenagers who send sexually explicit photos of themselves to each other, or even kids playing pranks on each other. They're sex offenders under the way these laws are written, and then they're going to get all the all the punishments and consequences that apply to sex offenders. And again, that category, when lawmakers are thinking about it, they're thinking about these really horrible examples. So some of these people will find themselves, someone who visits a prostitute, someone who urinates in public, teenagers who send themselves pictures, they'll find themselves on sex offender registries for the rest of their lives because that's a punishment that was set thinking about this kind of worst of the worst. And we do that across the board, from drug traffickers, where punishments are, they're thinking of El Chapo and they're not thinking of the kind of addict who sells some drugs to make money so they can buy their own drugs, but the punishments are set really high. So we do that across the board. And then, we also have, for many of our crimes, to make it easier for the government to prove them, really taken out, as you said, that mens rea, that mental state of mind kind of component. So you do have people who are on the hook for accidents, so someone who, they may use drugs with another person, and unbeknownst to them, the drugs were tainted. And if the other person dies, they can be on the hook for the homicide, because they gave the person those drugs, even though they had no idea that there was anything in there. Or another really common occurrence that happens under a doctrine called felony murder. So, you get a bunch of, and they're usually young people, group of young kids go out together. They decide they're going to go steal something from a house. And they shouldn't be doing that, and they should absolutely be punished for it. But they go to steal something from a house, and they thought it was empty, but it turns out someone's there. And one of them shoots the person who's in the house. Okay, now I think everyone would agree the person who shoots the homeowner, should be punished accordingly for that. But the way our law works is all the people who were there, even those kids who had no idea that their friend had a gun, they're all on the hook for felony murder. So we have people around the country serving life sentences because, they went on a burglary with a bunch of friends, as young as 13, 14 years old. And, one of them, without them knowing it, had a weapon, killed somebody. Before, they're now all on the hook for felony murder, and they're serving sentences of 50 years, 60 years, life. And without any requirement that the government prove that they had any awareness at all that there was any risk of death in the activity that they were engaged in. So we do that on an unbelievably common basis in the United States. So, so I guess I would put it in the category. It's not that there's not too many examples of someone engaged in completely innocent, non-wrongful behavior that finds themselves on the criminal side of the line. But what we do have are people who are committing criminal offenses. They know they're up to something that they shouldn't be doing, but it's a relatively minor thing. And what they end up with, though, is punished as if, they were the absolute worst, because there's just not a lot of thought that goes into what did they really know when they committed this thing. And particularly with young people, because most crimes are committed by people who are younger. And, we know the brain is not fully developed until 25. And until about then, we're not very good at thinking about risk. And, people succumb to peer pressure. And I probably don't need to tell your listeners this if they've been around anybody under the age of 25. You just know this by talking to them. But, there's brain science now to back it all up. And so, when we have these kids making these really stupid decisions because their brains just aren't fully formed, they're not thinking, oh, wow, this burglary could turn bad. But, that one bad decision can mean they're going to be in prison for the rest of their lives. And that's the kind of way in which our laws get, really, I would say, both as a retributive justice matter, they're disproportionate. And again, based on this kind of public safety utilitarian goal, they're not achieving that purpose either.
You talk a little bit about aging out of crime, and I think that concept is implicated in what you just said, but explain to us what aging out of crime is and why it matters.
Yeah, so this is another one. So I couldn't answer your what are all the causes of crime question because we don't have great research on that. But this one I can tell you, this is like the gold standard of research. We have, study after study after study has proven this time and again, that people age out of crime. It's called the age crime curve, and it's been, established everywhere. And here too, I think people's own intuitions will correspond to this. Like as I get older, I'm tired. I don't really like doing as many physical activities. So that's true of everybody. And so it's true of people who engage in criminal. So it's not just that their kind of brains are not, fully developed in terms of thinking about risk until they're 25. But, criminal behavior is a young person's activity in part because it does involve physicality, right? You got to be prepared to run. If someone is chasing you, there's you might be using force or the threat of force against others. So this is the kind of activity that people age out of. They age out of wanting to do that physical kind of behavior. And as people's brains develop, they realize, hey, wait a minute, this is really risky. What am I doing? And as people maintain stronger ties in terms of marriage and children and all those other things are also correlated with a decline in crime. But what we basically see is, as people reach the end of their 20s, their rates of criminal behavior go down. They continue to go down in their 30s and 40s. I mean, it is kind of interesting in the, 40 is the new 30 kind of thing that you'll see in terms of magazines. That is actually true of crime as well. So
Really?
It is taking people a little longer to age out of crime now. Than previously. So there is a sense in which we are all kind of, we're all getting a little younger.
For better or
but
worse.
They're still, exactly, but they are still aging out of it. So, the risk of someone in their 50s for most crimes is negligible. Now, there are some exceptions to the age crime curve. So for example, fraud. And white collar crime doesn't follow that same pattern, which makes some sense because, to commit a lot of those crimes, you need to be in a position that you can engage in the fraud, which sometimes requires you to work your way up in a company. And it's not the same kind of physicality. So we don't see that same relationship in that kind of crime. And, there's certain other categories of offenses that don't necessarily correspond. But for most crimes that are out there, your robberies, sex offenses, homicides, burglaries, your kind of core crimes that are of greatest concern to people, those are crimes that people age out of.
Is one of the great failures of our punishment policy that we take young people, overwhelmingly young men, and we punish them beyond the age at which they would have aged out of crime. But because we've left them in prison for so long, they now really know nothing else. And we've turned someone who wouldn't be a criminal anymore into a lifelong, or at least, I don't know, lifelong is maybe an overstatement, but they're a criminal for a whole lot longer than they otherwise would have been because of our incarceration policy.
Yeah, we are throwing lives away in a way that is really an embarrassment to our country. I mean, we are just assuming that people can't change, even though all the evidence is to, most people can. I'm not saying everybody, I think it's important for people who work in criminal justice reform to acknowledge there are some people who defy the age crime curve. And there are some people who, you could give them all the programming in the world and they're not going to change. But that's actually a really small proportion of the people who are incarcerated. The vast majority will, in fact, age out of those kinds of behaviors if you give them opportunities, you give them education, you give them vocational training. They will lead law-abiding lives. But we don't make those investments. And instead, we're so quick to throw away folks who could be productive members of our society. And, as you said, it's young men. It's disproportionately young men of color. And I think it's one of our nation's great tragedies that we don't value those lives and think about how we could help people get on paths where they are not engaging in criminal activity. And it's one of these things where I feel like, there's many motivations for someone to do it. I think for some people, just the fairness and the equity and the justice aspect of it would motivate them. Others personally know somebody, and they've really been touched by the system and how it needs to be reformed. But, even if it's none of those things, just as a matter of somebody's self-interest, just as someone who lives in America and wants it to be a safer place for themselves and their children and their loved ones, these policies are terrible, because 95% of the people who are incarcerated come back out again and rejoin communities. And we should be wanting to do everything we can so that when people do rejoin communities, they're set up to succeed and not set up to fail.
One of the things that I find interesting about the popular conversation about the courts, a couple of things. One, specifically, your old boss, Justice Scalia, I shouldn't say everybody, people who don't follow the courts carefully and these issues carefully assume that because Scalia was known as a conservative, that he's therefore going to be one of these, tough on crime, which I think both sides try to do that, but the right gets more credit or blame, however you want to view it, for being tough on crime, harsh penalties, kind of anti-criminal defendant. And Scalia was very much not that. He aligned with what a lot of people would consider the left on criminal justice matters. And can you discuss that a little bit and what his thinking was about criminal justice constitutional issues or statutory as well? But I think most of it came up at the Supreme Court, of course, in the constitutional context.
Yeah. And, here I think it's important to note how great the framers were on these issues. So, I'll put in my plug for the framing generation, recognizing that the public would be prone to too much severity. And they talk about it in the Federalist Papers. And they designed a government that was supposed to make it difficult for the government to take away people's individual liberty. The constitutional structure is brilliant in trying to provide so many checks against that. And even before the Bill of Rights was put in the Constitution, there was a right to a jury trial in Article 3. The pardon power is right next to the commander-in-chief power for the president. So, all over the Constitution is textual indications of concerns that the framers had with government overreach in criminal matters. And they talked about it. You can see it in the Federalist Papers and in framing documents. So that brings us to Justice Scalia, the originalist. So, if you're an originalist interpreter of the Constitution, then you care about what the original meaning of the Constitution is. So you look to see what those things meant to the framing generation. And you are a stickler for enforcing them because that's, the methodology that you have subscribed to. So I do think it's a byproduct of that commitment that to originalism that he was faithful to the design that the framing generation put in place, which meant protecting people, protecting the jury guarantee, and being very attuned to overreach in searches and seizures and Fourth Amendment law. Now, I will say, I think he had a weak spot that I don't think was consistent with the framing generation for the Eighth Amendment and the prohibition on cruel and unusual punishments. I think that one he got wrong. But I overall, if you were kind of to assess his record, very strong for criminal defendants and in statutes as well, because he was a real adherent to what's known as the rule of lenity, which is when you're interpreting a statute and it's ambiguous and you can't kind of tell, what it covers, what it doesn't, that you err on the side of protecting the interests of a defendant. And so you read the statute in a way that's more favorable to the criminal defendant. And, you do it on the theory that if the government's going to come down on someone, they have to be very clear before they do. So you put the onus on the government. And, if you get it wrong, they can go back and get the legislature to change it. So he was very good on the rule of lenity. In fact, someone did an empirical study and found that no justice, when he was on the court, ruled in favor of criminal defendants more using the rule of lenity than he did. And again, it's this commitment he had to textualism, to insisting that the government, cross all of its T's and dot all of its I's before it could come down against an individual. And I think you see this today. Libertarians in general, tend to be very attuned to the abuses in criminal justice matters. And so, I think it's less of a left-right issue than a kind of a vision that someone might have about the government and governmental power. Because it really, for anyone who's disturbed by governmental overreach and abuses of government, the criminal justice process in America should be right at the top of your list of things that are disturbing.
So when I was doing some research, not just reading your book, but getting a little bit more about your bio, getting ready for this, and I saw a reference to your clerkship with Justice Scalia, and it said right after saying that you had clerked for him, it said that Justice Scalia always hired one liberal to, I forget exactly, but basically to be a contrary viewpoint in his chambers. It didn't say you were the liberal that he hired. It just sort of implied that. Did you fit that role? And if you did, what was it like sparring with him when you saw things differently?
Yeah, so I don't know if I was that. I'm not sure. He didn't. So, not in my own bio is that listed. That's clearly in another source. Because I have
Yes,
no idea. Yeah, I would say that
it was the great legal magazine. I think it was Cosmopolitan.
Yeah, yes.
Which
Well,
that will tell you that's definitely a Google search and not because I just picked one up off of my shelf.
right. Well, he did like to hire people of different political backgrounds as a check on himself to make sure that he wasn't reaching outcomes because they were his preferred desired result in the world, but instead were just a result of fairly applying his methodologies, which I really admire and respect in terms of a hiring practice. I think it takes a self-confident, intelligent, conscientious person to do that, to go out of your way to make sure you have people who don't necessarily agree with your world outlook, to make sure that you're really being principled in how you do things. And so he did do that. And I know when he hired me that I am a Democrat, and I know that he knew that. I know that that seems grammatically wrong, but I think you get the idea. He was well aware of that fact when he hired me. But I'm not sure actually that I ended up serving much of a counter kind of role because, I tend to agree with his methodological preferences anyways. I myself, am pretty strong textualist in how I believe we should interpret laws. And, very much concerned with the history and origins of any constitutional provision, and that we be, honest brokers of what those things mean. So there wasn't a whole lot of, kind of divergence in terms of how we would approach a legal question. I think at the ballot box, probably yes. But in terms of kind of dealing with any kind of case that would come up in a courtroom, not so much. And we really didn't have many opportunities for that. I will say his kind of general work environment in his chambers was one of give and take. And he was very happy and eager to hear dissenting views and, why someone might think something should come out one way versus another. And there were a few, cases where I definitely, said why I thought things should come out differently. But at the end of the day, only one of us had been confirmed by the Senate to be a justice.
Right.
And so his vote was the vote that mattered, but it was a very respectful work environment and really a kind of model, frankly, at least that I've taken with me in terms of, how to create a nice workspace to really make sure you're really thinking about counter arguments and making sure you're getting to the right outcomes.
I want to close by, I don't always wrap up any topic that I'm discussing on an episode by wrapping it into personal responsibility, because it's my show and I don't have to. We can talk about what I want, even if I don't see a particular hook. But you made it easy because you used the term personal responsibility. And you're talking about how prisons and the people who run them, they're not required to be evaluated on things like recidivism rates, post-release employment rates, and substance abuse desistance. And I want to read, this is a longer quote than I would normally read, but I liked the quote and I think it's worth bringing up. You said, prosecutors and legislators pay no attention to these issues, meaning recidivism and so forth, because the public does not blame recidivism on the failure to provide programming, but instead tends to view the problem as innate to the individuals committing the crimes. If the issue is personal responsibility, then there is no one to blame but the person committing the crime, and no one asks prisons and jails to do more, meaning more programming. The result is that they do not, and public safety and welfare suffer as a result because the issue is not simply one of personal responsibility. We could be getting better outcomes with better programming, and our failure to do so is based on institutional pathologies, not sound practices. And that's the end of the quote. But the thing that I was thinking about when I read that is, there is a sense in which we can look at someone who commits a crime and say, well, that is your failure of personal responsibility. But there's a much more utilitarian approach to that, or pragmatic approach, whatever term you want to use. I don't want to stick it into the philosophical schools of utilitarianism or pragmatism, just more in the common usage of the words. If we just stand here and yell personal responsibility at people who are committing or have committed crimes and then stop there, we are, in a sense, abdicating our own responsibility to say, there is a world around me where people, for whatever reason, are doing things that are making the world a worse place. And so we need to do things that help those people to not make the world a worse place. It seems like strange phrasing to me. I can't take responsibility for someone else's crime, but I can take responsibility for doing something to change the policies and something to change how we treat people, and whether through incarceration or after incarceration or whatever the case may be, to assist them in leading productive lives that don't pose a danger to society. That's a bit of a soapbox, and there's not really a question there except to say, what are your thoughts on that interplay between personal responsibility of the criminals and then us as a culture, as a society, as a democracy, to try to figure out how to make things better?
Yeah, I think that was so well stated, and I agree completely. And I guess I would put it also as governmental responsibility. I think if you're going to have the government take away somebody's liberty and run, an institution where people are placed in cages, there's a real question to ask: how is that working? I do think there should be an onus on our government as well to just show results, because we're not asking for accountability. There's just, we don't measure the success of any prison in America based on what happens when people come out. And it creates a whole bunch of perverse incentives for the people who work and run those places because, from their perspective, it may make their lives and their jobs much easier to do something like take away, a prisoner's right to use phones, or to limit visitation, or to put them in solitary confinement, because those things might make it easier for them on a day-to-day basis to just kind of get people in line. But every study shows those things are terrible for when people come back out again, in terms of the ability of people to reintegrate successfully and not commit crime. So from, a public safety perspective, those are terrible policies. And we are not asking any of our prison officials to be accountable for the policies that they're implementing in terms of how they affect everyone in society, as opposed to just, what they mean on a day-to-day basis for a prison. So I would say it includes the personal responsibility of everyone in government to show that what they're doing is having a positive effect as opposed to a negative one. And then certainly just as a society and as we as individuals and voters think about things, is just recognizing that, people don't just act based on their own kind of individual decisions in a vacuum. They're part of a social community and they're part of an environment. And we know that there are strong effects of how those environments affect people and their choices and whether they choose to commit crimes. And so we could improve all that. We could definitely make things better, and make it more likely that people, when they do exercise their personal responsibility, have more choices available to them. So it's more likely that they choose correctly.
My guest today has been Professor Rachel Barkow of the New York University Law School and the author of Prisoners of Politics, Breaking the Cycle of Mass Incarceration. You can get her book on Amazon, and I assume Barnes & Noble. I will have links to it in the show notes. Professor, thank you so much for being on The Personal Responsibility Lawyer.
Oh, thanks so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
For Levins Trosclair and The Personal Responsibility Lawyer, I am Michael Levins, and I'll see you next time. This episode of the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast is brought to you by my law firm, Levins Trosclair, where we use the civil justice system to hold people responsible for irresponsible choices when those irresponsible choices cause serious injuries and sometimes even death. We are personal injury trial lawyers, but we approach our cases a little differently than a lot of other lawyers who do the same basic kind of work. I really, really hope that you do not need us, but if you do need us, please call us before evidence gets lost. You can call us at 512-535-1649. Tell us you heard about us on the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast. You can also go to our website on the interwebs at www.ltlegalteam.com. That's L as in Levins, T as in Trosclair, legalteam.com. We are here to help. Thank you for listening to the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast. If you like what you've heard or if you've learned something interesting, please do me a favor and rate the show on iTunes. It really does help. You can get more information about this show, including the show notes, at my personal website, michaellevins.com. And now I have to do some disclaimers where I say stuff that you already knew, but I got to say it anyway so that I keep the State Bar happy.
This podcast is not legal advice. You listening to this podcast does not make me your lawyer or you my client. Neither does it make any of my guests your lawyer. If you want me to be your lawyer, contact my office. If I can represent you, we will execute a written contract stating the specific terms under which I agree to represent you. Did you really need me to tell you that? I really, really hope not. Also, I am not certified by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization as a personal responsibility lawyer because they don't know what that is. They also have not certified me in any other areas of specialty that they actually do recognize. I think that does it for disclaimers. For Lovins Trosclair and the Personal Responsibility Lawyer podcast, I am Michael Lovins. We'll see you next time.